Hello and welcome back to Bookish and welcome back to Saturday Hodgepodge, my weekly wrap-up of books, booktube things having to do with books, or pretty much anything I want to talk about. One of the things I want to talk about today is, of course, the extraordinary times that we all live in. I suppose there are periods of history in my life which have felt relatively boring and uneventful and safe and secure. I don't really think any time period in history is like that, but the time period we're living in right now seems to be really kind of all up in the air, and as often, since I'm a history person, when things seem to be going crazy, I look for historical precedents or examples of things in the past that resemble or we can get lessons from today. And so what I want to talk about today specifically has to do with sedition, censorship, and kind of social media. Now, I'm not an expert on all the laws governing social media platforms like YouTube or like Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. I'm not sure I understand all those laws that are there, but I do know that in recent days, those social media platforms, or big tech, as people on the right like to call it, have come under fire for banning the president, President Trump, from their platform and his kids and anybody who essentially was acting as kind of a mouthpiece for President Trump. And this had directly to do with the fact that President Trump, incited a group of people, among whom were apparently hundreds of terrorists who went to the Capitol with all kinds of malicious intent, and they broke into the Capitol and killed a policeman. And essentially what I believe they're using to kind of suggest that they have to ban President Trump is that his speech, his talk, or excuse me, his tweets on Twitter, for instance, were spreading sedition or encouraging sedition, and that is against the law. And to be honest with you, sedition has never been a protected form of speech in the United States. But banning people from social media websites has led to people calling this censorship and silencing, and people trying to invoke their First Amendment rights. There's several things to keep in mind here. Number one, you don't have First Amendment rights that protect you from businesses censoring your speech. And Twitter and Facebook and YouTube are businesses. And, when you sign that thing, the terms of agreement, you agree that they can essentially censor you or to end your account depending on, the content that you put up on your account. That is not censorship. That is not a First Amendment violation. They are businesses, and this, the technology that makes their platforms possible is their property, and they get to regulate how that property is used and what kind of messages go up on that. So that's kind of the number one thing to keep in mind. This doesn't mean, in my opinion, that there isn't something to be concerned about. I don't have a problem, obviously, with preventing or kicking President Trump off of Twitter or any of these other social media sites. And YouTube, I know, took down some of his videos, one of his more recent videos. I don't have a problem with him doing that because I think clearly, intentionally or not, he is using those platforms to spread a really dangerous message. And again, the attack on the Capitol, the terrorist attack on the Capitol of January the 6th is proof of that. But what worries me is that in the wake of this, then I see a lot of people on the left who are calling for broader efforts to censor what they consider to be vile or dangerous content on social media. And certainly there are all kinds of things that I wish were not on social media. But the further we go in that direction, the more dangerous I think it becomes. If the government tells Twitter they have to, get rid of right-wing accounts from right-wing people, then you are getting to that point of censorship. You are getting to that point of the government saying this speech can't happen. And a lot of people seem to be calling for those kinds of things, which I think is going a step too far. I'm all for businesses having a decision or being able to make a decision based on business principles for what's best for them and what they want to limit, and not wanting their social media platform to be used to spread sedition or violence. That's great, and I do hope they monitor and find ways to eliminate more of that. But just because speech is unpleasant, just because speech is abhorrent to most of us, doesn't necessarily mean that it should be limited. And so I just want to really quickly kind of talk about the history of limits on free speech. in the United States, because I think a lot of people have this idea that the Founding Fathers were against any kind of government limits on free speech, and nothing could be further from the truth. You need to be aware that during the American Revolution, 1775 and 1776, Loyalist newspaper offices, those loyalists would have been people who wanted to stay loyal to England and not participate in the revolution and not go along with the Declaration of Independence. Loyalist presses and loyalist newspapers were shut down. Their editors were victims of physical attacks. Their printing presses were broken. Their businesses were shut down. And, you know, groups like the Sons of Liberty and other patriotic organizations we call in the United States perpetrated those events. During the presidency of John Adams, one of the great founding fathers is John Adams. During his presidency, he passed a series of laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts. Well, the Sedition Acts essentially made it illegal or made it seditious to criticize the president in his person or in his policies. That was John Adams who did that, and rightly so. It's one of the big black marks on John Adams' kind of reputation as a founding father. During the Civil War, Lincoln put limits on the freedom of speech and the freedom of press to stop, you know, negative portrayals of the war or to silence critics of the war. And during World War I, we had the Committee on Public Information, which limited the information Americans could see about what was going on during World War I. We did the same thing during World War II. And so, in a sense, what we're seeing with social media platforms banning people and limiting content on their channels is a part of that history, but there's an important distinction to make. The reality is that social media platforms doing this is actually far less a violation of the First Amendment than the efforts of the United States government during World War II or World War I or Lincoln during the Civil War, or John Adams with the Alien and Sedition Acts, or the Sons of Liberty during the early years of the American Revolution. You know, because these are actually government efforts to censor and limit information, to limit the distribution of ideas. In addition to that, I don't know if you noticed, but everything I mentioned, all these times when we limited free speech, several things to keep in mind about that. When we did so, there was a crisis with that one example. The one example being John Adams and the Sedition Acts, which were not really during a crisis. You know, theoretically, there was a kind of a pseudo-war going on with France, but not a real crisis. He just wanted to limit criticism of himself. But all the others are issued during a crisis, and in the United States we have a history of allowing limits to be placed on free speech, limits to be placed on our freedoms during a crisis, as long as that goes away. One thing I have optimism for that makes me feel like things might be okay in this area, and we shouldn't worry too much about these efforts to ban the president and his enablers from social media, is that we have always quickly retracted once the crisis is over. There's no doubt that the attack on the Capitol of January the 6th was a crisis. You know, we were in danger of losing our democracy. And in the wake of a crisis, censorship is one of those things which, like it or not, we've often done in the United States, and I think quite remarkably in this instance, it's actually private businesses doing it and not the United States government. So I realize there's a lot of push to try to limit the information that's on social media, and there's a lot of people resisting those efforts to ban people from social media. One of the things I would say is that both groups need to pay attention to history, and both need to realize that while in a crisis we'd be willing to accept these kinds of limits, once the crisis is passed, we probably don't want to go maintain those limits for very long, at least not if we want to, you know, continue on enjoying our freedom of expression. Anyway, there you go. There's my theory about, or my ideas about, and historical ideas about censorship and sedition in the United States. So to get to my, before I get to my reading, on Thursday I posted a video about my reading goals, which was just replete with mistakes. So I corrected those in the show notes, but I wanted to go ahead and correct them again here during the video. The first mistake was that I mentioned that I read this book of short stories called 13 Months of Sunrise, and I said it was by Leila Abuela, but in reality it was by Rania Mamoun, a Sudanese short story writer, and so I wanted to make sure that I got that right. The book was actually translated by Elizabeth Jaquette, so I want to make sure I mentioned that. And then as a part of kind of sort of trying to extend my Read German Books goal success in that video, I said that Lost in Math by Sabine Hossenfelder was written in German. It was not. This is not a translated book. It was not written in German. It should not count for that challenge. However, one of the books that I've been reading, one of the books of the book I finished this week was written in German. That's An Inventory of Losses by Judith Schalansky, and it was translated by Jackie Smith. I have to tell you that this book really puzzled me. I don't think I'm often kind of I don't think I'm often kind of confused by a book as much as I was by this one. In the first 100 pages, things became clearer, and I began to understand what the author was doing, and I think the author did it very well in the end. In addition to that, this is just a gorgeously designed book. Everything about this book makes me happy. There's no dust jacket. It's just, you know, the hardcover has the decoration and printing. All the images you see are have meaning in terms of the story. It's just a beautifully designed book, and there are all these kind of plates, which you're not going to be able to see. But each one of these plates that begins a new section has a picture which is barely visible there, as though, you know, you're losing your ability to see that image. And it talks about a fascinating kind of list of things that have gone by the wayside. It's not exactly what I thought. There's a blurb on the back that says, dazzling. Schalansky's meticulous researched stories are poignant reminders of the extent of our impact on the natural world and a call to honor the animals, objects, and places that due to our own negligence have ceased to exist. That's a fine blurb, and it fits with some of the essays, but not with all of them. And that's kind of, I think, part of what confused me. I wasn't exactly sure what the author was up to, but I figured it out, I think, and I ended up liking the book. But, you know, the book's also just awesome as a physical object, which I've mentioned to you before. I saw this book on Britta Bohler's channel, not necessarily a recommendation, but I just saw it on her channel. I thought it looked kind of cool, so that's why I bought it. I started reading 2 books this week and last. The first one of those books I started reading is Angle of Repose by Wallace Stegner. This is a book that I was recommended, and I picked up a recommendation from Books of My Reading, Kelly from Books of My Reading, and I am on page 350 or so, yeah, and this has just been great. It's one of those books that I'm reading slowly. I think I'm reading slowly and savoring it and enjoying all of the nuances of the language and the complexity of the story and the beauty in which nature is described, and then all of a sudden I'll look up and I've read 50 pages. I'm really enjoying this book. And then I also then started reading The Other Name by Jan Fosse. This was a book I saw on Silje's channel. Fosse is a Norwegian writer. He's mainly a playwright, I believe, but she said she loved this book, and that was good enough for me. I am, right now, I think I am on page 53, and it took me a little while to get going and to find my way into the book, but once I did, this has just been really mesmerizing. It reminds me a lot of things. A little bit Beckett, a little bit W.G. Sebald, but it's been really an adventure, and I'm enjoying it. I hope that the rest of the book holds up. So that's what I've been reading this week. Also, let's see, I've been watching some stuff. One of the things that I just finished up on that was on Netflix today was a series called Pretend It's a City, in which Martin Scorsese interviews Fran Lebowitz, the kind of humorous writer and inveterate New Yorker, Fran Lebowitz. This series was recommended to me by Joni Heisenberg. Joni Heisenberg is one of our faithful BookTube community commenters that we all depend on and love so much. She doesn't have a channel of her own, but she does watch a lot of videos and leave comments, and we all appreciate that. So, and in this case, she made an excellent recommendation. I'd intended to try to space out my watching of those shows, but I just kind of watched them all in one big rush. So I can highly recommend that. There's a lot of discussion about books. You know, not all of Leibowitz's opinions are necessarily going to sit well with everybody, but it was just I thought, a great kind of intellectual discussion and kind of fun thing about New York. And then just kind of one of those serendipity things. I watched one of the videos where one of Steve Donahue's come back to technology videos the other day, in which he got a book about narrow boating. That is, narrow canal boats that go through the canals in England. It's a whole lifestyle thing. And when he mentioned the book, I was just completely taken aback because I started watching a series on Amazon Prime called Travels by Narrowboat by a guy named, I think his name is Kevin Shelley. Calls himself the Country House Gent. Anyway, it is literally just him traveling the canals of England on a narrowboat, and it's nerdy and, you know, slow paced, but I've been really enjoying that. So, you know, if that sounds good to you, if you're an Anglophile kind of like me, maybe that sounds good to you, you want to watch it. It is on Netflix, and again, I think it's called Travels by Narrowboat. Anyway, I think that's it for this week. Well, I'm going to call that it for this week. Anyway, look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.